The American Civil War stands as a pivotal moment in black history, signaling the end of slavery and granting freedom to millions of enslaved black individuals. However, the journey towards emancipation and equality was fraught with immense challenges. For centuries, black people endured unspeakable atrocities under the institution of slavery, ranging from physical abuse and forced labor to the separation of families and the denial of basic human rights. The American Civil War, fought between 1861 and 1865, arose from the fundamental conflict over the institution of slavery. The southern states, heavily reliant on the labor-intensive plantation system, sought to preserve their economic and social order built on the backs of enslaved people. In contrast, the northern states, driven by abolitionist movements and a growing sentiment against slavery, fought for its abolition and the principles of equality and justice. As the war raged on, the death toll steadily rose. Thousands of black soldiers, motivated by the hope of securing their freedom, enlisted in the Union Army, fighting alongside their white counterparts. In a courageous move, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1862, declaring that all enslaved people in Confederate territories were to be set free. This bold step aimed to weaken the Confederacy's foundation by depriving it of its labor force. However, Lincoln's commitment to justice would cost him his life. On April 14, 1865, he was assassinated, leaving the nation in mourning and the fate of black Americans uncertain. The Emancipation Proclamation, combined with the subsequent ratification of the 13th Amendment in 1865, officially abolished slavery throughout the United States. It marked a monumental shift in the nation's trajectory, symbolizing hope and freedom for millions of black people who had endured the horrors of slavery. Yet the promise of liberation was met with fierce resistance. White supremacists, threatened by the prospect of racial equality, embarked on a campaign to assert their dominance and control over society. They enacted oppressive laws known as Jim Crow laws and black codes, which aimed to strip black citizens of their newfound rights and reestablish white supremacy. Within this landscape of racial oppression, convict leasing emerged as one of the most egregious forms of exploitation. In this video, we are going to take a step back into the annals of time to reveal a part of history that is never taught in schools or mentioned in the history books. Before we get right into the video, please smash the like button and subscribe to the channel to keep informed of our eye-opening black narrative. Convict leasing was a system after the Civil War in which Southern governments would lease prisoners to different private industries like railways, mines, and large plantations. The main beneficiaries of this system were the state governments, while the prisoners themselves received no pay and faced brutal working conditions. The private companies would benefit as they were receiving cheap labor that they could exploit however they liked. During the era of convict leasing, African Americans were frequently arrested for minor offenses and subjected to racially motivated court proceedings. The discriminatory practices within the criminal justice system targeted black individuals, ensuring their disproportionate representation in prisons and facilitating their participation in the convict leasing system. Racial bias was deeply embedded within the law enforcement agencies and courts of that time. Police officers, often influenced by racial prejudices, selectively targeted black individuals, making arrests for trivial or fabricated reasons. African Americans were more likely to be stopped, questioned, and arrested than their white counterparts, creating an unjust cycle of criminalization. Once arrested, African Americans faced a court system that was rife with racial bias. The judges, juries, and other court officials were often influenced by prejudiced views and stereotypes, leading to unfair trials and harsh sentencing. Black defendants were frequently denied legal representation, faced all-white juries, and encountered judges who held deeply ingrained racial prejudices. These racially motivated court proceedings resulted in the disproportionate conviction and sentencing of black individuals. Minor offenses that would have led to lenient punishments for white defendants often carried severe penalties for African Americans. The goal was not only to punish them for their alleged crimes, but also to feed the demand for convict labor and ensure a steady supply of incarcerated individuals for leasing. The discriminatory practices within the criminal justice system worked hand in hand with the oppressive laws of the time, such as the Black Codes and later the Jim Crow laws, to maintain racial subjugation and economic exploitation. African Americans were systematically targeted and arrested for behaviors that were specific to their communities, such as loitering, vagrancy, or petty theft. These actions were then magnified in court, resulting in convictions that perpetuated the cycle of black imprisonment and the availability of labor for leasing. Convict leasing began in Alabama in 1846, and in 1883, about 10% of Alabama's total revenue was derived from convict leasing. In 1898, nearly 73% of total revenue came from this same source. Death rates among leased convicts were approximately 10 times higher than the death rates of prisoners in non-leased states. In 1873, for example, 25% of all black leased convicts died. By 1868, Georgia, having been convinced of the financial possibilities of convict leasing, would give in to the inhuman trade. Officials during Reconstruction after the Civil War approved the leasing of prisoners to private citizens. Provisional Governor Thomas Ruger awarded the first convict lease to William A. Fort of the Georgia and Alabama Railroad on May 11, 1868. Fort was given 100 African American prison laborers for 1 year at the price of $2,500. Fort was responsible for taking care of the prisoners' basic needs during the year that they were in his possession. 16 prisoners died during that first year while working for private entities. From the government's point of view, the program was successful. In 1869, the state decided to lease out all of the 393 prisoners in the penitentiary for no fee to the contracting firm Grant, Alexander and Company to work on the Macon and Brunswick Railroad. Within 5 years, convict leasing was a major source of revenue for the state. Over a span of 18 months in 1872 and 1873, the hiring out of prison labor brought Georgia more than $35,000. With this success, the state legislature passed a law in 1876 that endorsed the leasing of the state's prisoners to one or more companies for at least 20 years. 3 companies took on these convicts at the price of $500,000 to be paid at intervals over the 20-year span of the lease. During this period, there were attempts to reform the system of convict labor in Georgia, although such efforts were never successful, in part because of the sheer profitability of the convict lease system. This system thrived in prisons where the majority of inmates were black, such as the Angola prison in Louisiana, Parchman Farm in Mississippi, and Rikers Island in New York. The Angola prison was notably one of the most brutal in the era of convict leasing. The prison played a significant role in the implementation of the convict leasing system, perpetuating the dehumanization and exploitation of black men who were essentially treated as slaves. The Louisiana State Penitentiary, more commonly known as Angola, is a sprawling 18,000-acre complex that confines more than 6,000 inmates. The prison sits in a land bowl surrounded on 3 sides by the Mississippi River, and on the remaining side by the rugged, often impenetrable Tunica Hills. It is said that the bones of the hundreds of slave inmates who died building the levee system protecting the land bowl from the mighty river, and whose bodies were left in the mud where they dropped, can be heard whispering in the sweaty darkness that engulfs the prison fields at night. Angola has been a slave plantation since its inception in the 1830s. It was named after the former Portuguese nation of Angola, located on the west coast of southern Africa, from which thousands of Africans were slave shipped around the world, with hundreds ending up in the new state of Louisiana. Many of the ancestors of those slaves had actually arrived in the Louisiana Territory as early 1722. While Angola was still a thriving slave plantation, Louisiana First Prison was established in 1835 in Baton Rouge. It was known as the Walls, under the administration of Governor André Bienvenu Roman. By the time Alexandre Mouton became the state's 11th governor in 1843, the state coffers were strapped for cash. Born on a slave plantation in 1804, Mouton understood the profits that could be made from slave labor. As a way to reduce state expenditures and avoid raising taxes, Mouton in 1844 established the convict lease system that allowed private contractors to use the free labor of the inmates in the walls in exchange for nominal fees to the state. It became a very corrupt and lucrative practice for the state's political system. The racist that he was, Mouton led Louisiana's secession from the Union in 1861 and was a devout member of the slaveholding Confederacy during the Civil War. 5 years after the Civil War, and with the collapse of its economy, the state of Louisiana awarded its convict lease system in 1870 to a former Confederate major named Samuel Lawrence James. James was a ruthless human profiteer. He became part of what Wall Street Journal journalist David Blackman called in his book, Slavery by Another Name, the Age of Neo-Slavery. It was an age when freed black men were hauled off into Southern prison confinement for little or no reason at all. To Major James, it was an age of profit. The year before James gained control of Louisiana's convict lease system, the 13th Amendment was ratified to the U.S. Constitution just 8 months after the Civil War. The amendment abolished slavery except as punishment for crime. The 13th Amendment gave Major James a constitutional license to reimpose slavery on the Angola slave plantation through the convict lease system. In effect, the convict lease system provided the Confederate major with the same economic benefits as slavery. He even housed the black convicts in the plantation's former slave quarters. During his first 10 years with the convict lease, the major accumulated enough wealth to purchase the slave plantation in 1880. For the next 3 decades, James ruled over a brutal convict work system that left untold hundreds dead and buried in unmarked graves in the plantation's rich soil. Some died from illness, others from the rigors of forced slave labor, while others were either beaten or gunned down by James's prison guards. Major James's convict lease system was so profitable that the state of Louisiana purchased the plantation from him in 1901. The state then initiated its own profitable slave-styled penal enterprise, creating its brutal convict guard system in 1917 that allowed trusted inmates to carry guns to guard and clubs to beat inmates. Roughly 75% of the inmate population at Angola today is black, while the state's black population is slightly more than 30%. The sprawling prison plantation, as it is fondly called by locals, is still managed as a modern-day slave plantation just as it was in the mid-1800s. The inhumane practice of convict leasing inflicted significant and long-lasting effects on African Americans during and after the era of its implementation. The impacts of this exploitative system were profound and encompassed various aspects of individuals' lives, including their physical well-being, socioeconomic status, and societal standing. The physical conditions endured by those subjected to convict leasing were often brutal and hazardous. Long hours of labor in grueling environments, coupled with inadequate nutrition and health care, led to physical exhaustion, malnutrition, and rampant diseases. The harsh treatment and abuse suffered by leased convicts resulted in lasting physical injuries and trauma, leaving a lasting impact on their overall health and well-being. These conditions were so brutal that many mines and plantations had secret graveyards for men who had been beaten or tortured to their demise. Other convicted men were forced to fight each other, sometimes to their demise, for the entertainment of their supervisors. The psychological toll was equally devastating. The dehumanization, constant surveillance, and abuse inflicted on African American convicts caused psychological distress, eroded self-esteem, and perpetuated a sense of hopelessness. The trauma experienced during this period had long-term psychological effects on individuals and their descendants, contributing to intergenerational trauma within black communities. The convict leasing system reinforced racial segregation and societal divisions. Black individuals, even after their release from prison, faced discrimination, limited access to education and employment, and exclusion from mainstream society. The legacy of convict leasing further deepened racial disparities and hindered progress towards racial equality. Convict leasing began to face significant opposition and scrutiny as public awareness grew about its exploitative nature and the abuses associated with it. The efforts of activists, reformers, and organizations advocating for prison reform and the abolition of convict leasing eventually led to its demise. The precise year of convict leasing's abolition varied across states, but the practice largely ended in the early 20th century. However, it is important to note that the abolition of convict leasing did not eradicate the systemic racism and discrimination faced by African Americans. It merely marked a transition to other forms of racial oppression within the criminal justice system, such as chain gangs and discriminatory sentencing practices. The legacy of convict leasing continues to shape the experiences of African Americans to this day. Its impact can be seen in the persistent racial disparities within the criminal justice system, the economic inequities faced by black communities, and the ongoing fight for racial justice and equality. Recognizing this legacy is crucial in understanding the root causes of racial inequality and working towards systemic reforms that address the historical and ongoing injustices faced by African Americans. As always, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to our channel, and share our videos to let more people know the truth about blacks and to hear their own part of the narratives. Thanks for watching.